Robert Hanley stepped off the freight train at Cedar Gap just after noon, when the sun was hard and white over the Nebraska plains. The town was new enough that the streets still looked raw. Boardwalks stood in front of a few stores. Fresh lumber still shone pale in the light. The depot was a simple box of wood, but it already had a name board nailed above the door, and that made the place feel almost finished. Robert stood for a moment with his grip in his hand and looked around. Wind moved across the grass beyond the tracks. Dust slid in low waves down Main Street. Far out on the open plain, the sky met the earth in one long flat line. He had seen a lot of towns like this while he worked rail jobs and bridge crews, but Cedar Gap had a different kind of hope in it. The town was not trying to look grand. It was trying to stay alive. A man with a dark mustache came out of the depot and waved. "Robert Hanley? That's me. Sam Mercer. I'm the foreman for the well and tank job. Glad you made it." Sam shook his hand hard. "We need that iron tank set before dark. If the town gets its first good water supply in place, folks can sleep easier." Robert looked toward the street. In front of the depot sat the heavy tank on a wide wagon bed. It was a big iron cylinder, dark and dull, with round seams and thick bands around it. Two strong horses stood in the traces, heads down, tails twitching at flies. The wagon wheels had sunk deep into the soft street. "That's the load?" Robert asked. Sam gave a short laugh. "That's the load. It took 2 days to haul it from the rail yard with 4 mules. We won't move it again by hand. The frame is up. We just need it lifted into the sand pit by the well." Robert nodded. He knew why the town wanted a tank so badly. On the plains, a town without water could not last. A dry week could turn into a hard month. A strong wind could turn one small fire into a disaster. A boy came out of the depot carrying a bucket with a rag in it. He looked about 12 years old and had a red face from the sun. "Tommy," Sam said, "go tell Mr. Wallace to clear the platform. We need room for the rope team." Tommy ran off. Sam pointed to the lot beside the depot. A rough wooden frame had been built over a shallow pit filled with sand. Thick posts stood at each corner, with crossbars and a pulley at the top. The whole thing looked plain and strong. "Pete Jensen says the pit will keep the tank from cracking when it drops," Sam said. "He swears by it. If his ropes hold, it'll work," Robert said. Sam glanced at him. "You worry about the ropes? That's why we sent for you." They walked over to the boarding house for dinner first, because Mrs. Ida Barlow did not like men working heavy jobs on an empty stomach. Her place stood on the next block, a 2-story house with a covered porch and lace curtains in the front windows. Inside, the air smelled of beans, bacon, and fresh bread. Mrs. Barlow set plates in front of Robert and Sam and said, "Eat fast. The wind is picking up." Robert looked out the window. Cottonwood leaves flipped and flashed in the yard. Far west of town, he saw a low line of dust moving under the sky. "Rain coming?" he asked. Mrs. Barlow shook her head. "Not rain, just dry wind. Worse than rain, if you ask me. It dries the grass right down to tinder." Pete Jensen, the well driller, sat at the table across from them. He was a thin man with gray in his beard and hands that looked cut by wire. He had the calm face of a man who had spent a lot of time waiting on the ground to tell him what was under it. "The well's ready," Pete said. "We hit good water yesterday. All we need is that tank in place. Then the pump can fill it, and the town can draw from it." Robert tore bread in half and ate quickly. Any fire danger around here? Pete gave him a look. This is August on the Nebraska plains. There's always fire danger. When they finished, Robert and the others went back to the depot. More people had gathered by then. Men in work shirts leaned against posts. Women held sun hats in both hands. Children stood in a row close to the boardwalk. Everyone wanted to see the first water tank go up. It was more than a piece of iron. It was a sign that Cedar Gap meant to grow. Hank Doyle, the blacksmith, was there with a hammer in his belt. Ben Wallace, the depot agent, kept looking at the tracks. He was a nervous man with a clean shirt and a pencil behind one ear. "The eastbound freight is late," Ben said. "If it comes in while we're lifting, it'll have to slow down." Sam gave him a sharp look. It can wait. So can everything else. This town wants water. The men took their places. Robert checked each rope himself. He ran his hands over the fiber, feeling for bad spots or loose ends. The ropes were thick, but the load was heavy enough to test them hard. He bent to the wagon bed and studied the tank straps. "Who's riding the frame?" he asked. "You are," Sam said. "If anything slips, you see it first." Robert glanced up at the rough tower of posts and crossbars. The wood was new, still full of saw marks. At the top, the pulley wheels squeaked in the heat. "All right," he said. The men set to work. They hooked the ropes, braced the lines, and began to pull. The tank rose an inch at a time. The wagon bed groaned. The horses stamped and tossed their heads. The people on the boardwalk stepped back to make room. Robert climbed the frame and moved along one beam at a time, one boot in front of the other. The wood was rough and hot under his palms. From up high, he could see the whole town at once: the depot, the new store, the post office, a half-finished hotel, and beyond them, the flat sea of grass. A lone hawk hung in the air over the prairie. "Hold steady!" Sam called from below. The tank swung a little, then settled. Robert watched the ropes and the knots. One line on the north side had begun to fray where it rubbed against the beam. He opened his mouth to call down when he heard a sharp crack from the rail side of town. A freight engine had rolled in on the siding. A long curl of smoke drifted from its stack. Then, with the wind behind it, a glowing cinder flew from the engine and landed in the dry grass near the edge of the right-of-way. At first it looked small, just a bright spot among the weeds. Then the wind hit it. The grass bent low. The little spark ran along the edge of the field like a line of light. In 2 breaths, it became flame. "Fire!" someone shouted. The cry hit the crowd like a slap. Men turned. Women grabbed children. Ben Wallace dropped his pencil. A few people ran for buckets before anyone had even told them where to go. The fire was still far out, but it moved fast. The dry grass carried it forward. The wind shoved it toward town in a flat orange wave. Sam looked up at Robert. "Can you finish the lift?" Robert stared at the flame line. It was growing wider by the second. A new gust drove sparks across the track. If the fire reached the depot lot before the tank was safe, the wagon would block the street and the horses might panic. The iron tank itself could be lost, and with it the town's first water supply. The wagon wheel on the north side had sunk deeper into the dirt. It was not going anywhere fast. "We don't have time for a full hoist," Robert called down. "Get the horses loose and clear the street." Sam cupped his hands. "Can you get it into the pit?" Robert looked from the wagon to the sand pit beside the frame. The tank hung close enough. The last rope still held it steady. "Yes," he shouted. "Pull the west line tight. Then stand back." Hank Doyle and 2 other men rushed to the line. They heaved until the rope sang. The tank moved half a foot. Below, the wagon frame creaked, and one wheel slid in the dirt. The fire was nearer now. Smoke rolled over the grass, dark against the blue sky. People coughed and pulled cloth over their mouths. A woman yelled for her son. A man ran toward a water barrel with a bucket in each hand. Robert reached for the blade at his belt. He was not fond of cutting a load loose in midair, but he trusted the pit. Pete Jensen had dug it deep for a reason. The sand would catch the tank and keep it from cracking. "Everybody back!" Robert shouted. He climbed higher, one hand on the beam, one boot on a brace. The frame shook under him. From below, Sam called, "Easy now!" Robert leaned out over the hanging tank. The iron was hot from the sun. Sweat ran into his eyes. He wiped it away with his sleeve and saw the last rope stretched tight, white as bone in the light. A shout came from the west side of the street. "The fire's in the weeds by the loading pen." That was close. Too close. Robert took one breath, then another. He raised the blade, set it against the rope, and cut hard. The line snapped apart. The tank dropped. For one instant, it fell straight and silent, heavy as a house. Then it hit the sand pit with a deep boom that shook dust into the air. Sand flew up around it in a brown cloud. The frame gave a short groan, and the wagon lurched back with a hard jolt, free at last from the weight. The crowd froze. Then Robert heard Pete shout, "It held! The tank's hold!" The iron cylinder lay deep in the pit, not broken, not bent. One end settled a little lower than the other, but the sand had done its work. A dark bead of water ran out from a small seam near the bottom and soaked into the sand. "Get the valve open," Pete cried. 3 men ran to the pit. Hank grabbed one side. Ben Wallace, no longer careful about his clean shirt, climbed down in a hurry and started for the pump. Another man hauled the wagon horses clear of the street. The fire was almost at the depot fence now. Flames licked through the weeds and leapt at a stack of scrap lumber. The wind pushed smoke over the new buildings. People coughed and shouted. But the street was open now, and the tank was safe in the pit. "Buckets!" Sam yelled. "Fill every bucket you can find." Women and men moved at once. Mrs. Barlow came out of her boarding house with a washtub. Tommy ran past Robert with a bucket nearly too big for him to hold. Ben Wallace, red-faced and out of breath, pulled the hand pump on the new well as if his life depended on it. Water began to rise with a dull slap inside the pipe. Pete crouched by the tank valve and worked at it with both hands. At last he got it open. Water poured into the pit, dark at first, then bright when it caught the light. "It's coming!" Pete shouted. The first bucket filled. Then another. Men dashed to the depot roof and soaked the dry boards. Others threw water on the grass at the edge of town. The line of flame reached the first fence, then broke as wet ground met fire. It still burned hard in places, but the worst of it lost strength. Robert climbed down from the frame and jumped to the ground. His hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the effort. He grabbed a bucket from Tommy and helped carry it to the depot wall. He splashed water over the dry boards while smoke stung his eyes. Near him, Sam Mercer was barking orders. "Keep the horses out of the lane," he yelled. "Wet the corner shed. Ben, get those barrels in a line." No one stood still. Even the children helped, passing full pails from hand to hand. The fire pushed one more time, then weakened. The wind was still there, but the open grass around town had already burned black. Without fuel, the flames could not keep running. They crawled and then broke apart into smaller patches. A half-hour later, the worst of it was over. People stood in the street, dirty and tired, looking at the blackened edge of the prairie. Smoke drifted up in thin ribbons. The depot still stood. So did the store, the post office, and the boarding house. A few fence rails had burned. A stack of cordwood was lost. But Cedar Gap was still there. Tommy sat down on the boardwalk and laughed from sheer relief. Mrs. Barlow put a hand over her mouth and nodded once, as if she had not yet trusted herself to speak. Ben Wallace leaned on the pump handle and looked at Robert. If that tank had stayed on the wagon, we'd have lost it. Maybe the street, too. Robert wiped soot from his face. It would have been a bad place to stop. Pete Jensen climbed out of the pit and slapped the side of the iron tank. Good work on that cut. 1 second later, and we'd be cooking supper in the dirt. Sam Mercer came over and stared at Robert for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. "You saved the load," he said. "And maybe the town with it." Robert shook his hand. His shirt was wet with sweat and water, and his boots were full of dust, but he could feel something steady in him now. Not pride, exactly. More like a clear kind of relief. That night, Cedar Gap smelled of smoke and wet earth. Men took turns walking the edge of town until midnight, just in case another spark showed up. The tank stayed in its sand pit, full and safe. By lantern light, Robert could see the smooth black curve of its side and the puddles around it shining like glass. The next morning, the town came back to the well site before sunrise. The sky was pale gold in the east. The air felt cooler, and the first signs of smoke were gone. Pete Jensen worked the pump while Robert and the others set new ropes around the tank. Sam had decided the frame would stay. They would raise the tank again, but this time they would do it with care and more hands. "We have water now," Mrs. Barlow said as she brought coffee in a tin pail. "And that is worth more than sleep." Nobody argued with her. By late afternoon, the iron tank stood upright on its supports beside the well, steady and solid against the sky. Water climbed into it in a slow, deep rush. When the first stream ran full, the men on the ground cheered. Even Ben Wallace, who cheered like a man trying not to, clapped hard enough to make his palms sting. Robert stood back and looked at the tank. It was not pretty. It was dark with soot in one place, and one side had a dent from the fall. But it stood. It would hold water through dry weeks and hot winds. It would give Cedar Gap a better chance than it had the day before. Sam came up beside him. "You heading out once this job's done?" Robert watched the water rise in the tank. Maybe not right away. Sam smiled a little. "Good. We could use a man who knows when to cut a line and when to trust the ground." Robert gave a tired grin and looked across the town. The depot was still there. The boardwalks were black in places where they had been wet down, but the buildings stood. People were already talking about fresh paint, a new feed store, and another house on the east side. The prairie wind still moved over the grass beyond town. That would never change. But now Cedar Gap had something more than hope. It had water. And when the sun went down behind the Nebraska plain, the new tank caught the last light and shone like a promise.